This tradition was not abandoned by African Americans with the turn to philosophy in the United States. Rather, this tradition of learned clergymen continued in many all-black institutions for a longer period than Cook argues. Mays followed this long-established American pattern of clergyman scholars turned college president. What makes Mays stand out is that he used his status to publicly exhort an anti-racist theology that he believed was in accord with his Baptist theological tradition. In 1964, Benjamin Mays authored an article titled, "I've Been a Baptist All My Life." In this article, he cited freedom as being a core virtue of being a Baptist. As he explained, this freedom has been abused and sometimes still is, but for a Baptist preacher, it is a good and sure feeling to have the right to say what he thinks and believes without interference from some bishop or anybody else higher up. He noted further in his article, there is something in the beliefs of the Baptists, the freedom of conscience, the dignity and worth of every man, each man's individual right to direct access to God. This has given the Negro preacher the power he has, the conviction and the ability to preach and to move people. For Mays, the freedom he sought was both religious and social. This freedom was deeply democratic, and it was at the core of his Baptist tradition and heritage. To be religious was to be free. To be free was the freedom to hold religious belief. The movement for civil rights was for him as much a theological movement for justice as it was a way toward removing the sociological strictures against Americans of African descent. This religious freedom, he interpreted, imparted a freedom to be intellectually honest in his assessment concerning the struggles of African Americans. He wanted African Americans to be free of both racial and spiritual barriers in their social struggle to live dignified life. This is why Mays took theology so seriously. It was the idea source that guided ordinary activities of African American Christians. For him, theology served as a moral discourse and a vehicle to enact constructive social change. In a lecture given at Yale University Divinity School in 1952, Mays stated, "Beliefs are not theoretical things divorced from actions. Beliefs always find themselves expressed in actions. It is psychologically impossible to believe something and to act constantly contrary to belief. Knowledge is never ours until we have acted upon it. It might be said that we know only that which we have experienced, and our beliefs are confirmed only by our actions. Beliefs are more than intellectual assents. They involve convictions, and convictions involve actions. We believe what we do, and we are what we do." So, in conclusion, I hope by contributing this research on Mays that multiple publics will gain some perspectives on the variety of ways in which African American religious beliefs, in this instance, the Christian tradition, generated ideas and was discussed within African American communities as intellectual ideas. I want to echo the historian Clarence Thomas, I'm in the Doyle Institute, oh boy. I want to echo Clarence Taylor's assessment of the problem of black religious intellectuals. Taylor writes, "The problem with many general works that have examined African American religious intellectuals and American intellectualist thought is that they exclude African Americans entirely. This non-recognition of black religious intellectual thought dismisses the intellectual capital and activities of African Americans. The scarcity of information about black religious figures as intellectuals presents an incomplete picture of the black intellectual traditions. The near non-appearance of black religious thinkers in the literature on black intellectuals and American religions forges the view that few, if any, religious figures were among this group. It also leaves the racist impression that African Americans stress intuition and not analytical thought. Hopefully, this research will contribute to the growing discussion and stand alongside a rich and important body of literature regarding African American religious, intellectual, in the wider orb of American history and culture. Thank you for your time, and I'll take questions from you. So there are these young people with questions, so any questions? Yes, up. Yes, someone has to start. Thank you, Anne.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Kinda like Diana Ross or something.
Yeah.
It's thrilling. Now I forget the question. When I was in graduate school, we were taught that the twin pillars, the formative pillars of Black intellectual life and thought, were Du Bois and Booker Washington, and you sort of everyone else, like a satellite, circulated around those two poles. Now, of course, they're the generation before Mays, but clearly it's the point where he's in formation. If you had to put him as a satellite around either of those poles, which would it be, or is he just breaking away and in his own orbit?
No. First of all, he thought both Du Bois and Washington misdiagnosed the problem. So he was critical of them. But I want to remind you that that in Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois's great book, he has a chapter dedicated to Alexander Crummell. And Crummell is a Black Episcopal priest who had served as a missionary in Liberia and had formed the American Negro Academy in the 19th century. And so Mays would see himself in the tradition of Crummell, who was Du Bois's mentor. So we often forget these figures for Du Bois, but you know there were other people before Du Bois and other people like that. So Mays was quite critical because he was a sharecropper, and Du Bois had never been a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, and he thought that that Black education had to be for some young people training for employment, not like Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. really never trained a lot of people too much for employment. And also those people who needed to learn the classics like he had, training in Latin and Greek and other things, the liberal arts. So he thought both of those, they were, you know, that was a false distinction that was being made. Yes. Yeah, it's the microphone. Oh, yeah, but the people in the back need to hear.
Okay. I have a lot of questions, but I think I'll just ask this particular one. I know that he was president when Martin Luther King was at Morehouse.
That's correct.
Can you talk about that relationship and what evidence do we have, papers, you know, letters, correspondence, whatever?
Sure. Mays was King's mentor. Mays wrote a rather, if you go to Claiborne Carson's great volumes of papers, you'll see that Mays wrote his recommendation to seminary saying, you know, the King was a middling student, but he had potential.